Hello, everyone, or another edition of Toronto Business Journal and the Ottawa Market, where we talk about various social commentary and interesting political topics that pertain to who we are as Canadians, Canadian identity, and Canadian politics. And we have an amazing guest today to talk about a little bit about his book and his insights that he shared with people across Canada and the States and the world concerning this ongoing topic that keeps raising its ugly head of the 51st state. Stephen Marche is the author of The Next Civil War and writes for The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Guardian, and other fantastic and amazing publications across the world and in Canada. So thank you very much, Mr. Marche, for taking the time on this show of ours to talk about this ongoing topic of the 51st state and your insights. Particularly, I sort of ran across you on an interesting topic that you were talking about. I think it was on an American show that was featured on YouTube, and it relates to your article, The U.S. Threat Looming Over Canada in relationship to the 51st state. And that's why I brought you on the show, because I wanted to get a sort of a different sort of perspective, a nuanced perspective compared to what we've been going on and on about. And just to introduce people to your article who haven't read it before, what was the salient and main theme running in your article concerning the U.S. threat and the 51st state that you published in The Atlantic?
Well, I mean, really what it was trying to contemplate the unthinkable and think through the unthinkable. I mean, the idea of America annexing Canada is not something we've ever thought about. It's not something we have a tradition even of contemplating as a policy option, right? As something that we would ever have to face. And so I wanted to look at what would happen if America actually went through on this threat to annex Canada as a 51st state. And this is a very remote possibility. I don't think it needs to be considered beyond, it's still relatively in the realm of science fiction. On the other hand, great powers, when they slide into autocracy, when they slide into authoritarianism, do have a tendency to sort of become violent towards their neighboring countries. This is something that happens all around the world. That's something that I thought a lot about in the next Civil War. And so I went and asked a series of experts really on, what that would look like, right? And particularly Aisha Ahmad, who, is a really leading expert on insurgency and counterinsurgency. And she sort of painted a portrait for me of what an American conquest would do to Canada and what Canada would do to the United States if it was conquered.
Awesome. Yeah. So with that in mind, one thing which I notice when I look at, social media is that it seems to me that is a idea which has been more contemplated by Americans than in American media and American discussion in Canada. In Canada, it seems to be very much a taboo, and we seem to be primarily focusing on this idea of, tariff countermeasures, and not the idea that annexation, by its implication, has a military context in mind of the physical takeover by force of another country. With that in mind, do you think that that Canadian media has been doing us perhaps a disservice by not engaging Canadians and policymakers in that idea? Or what is your sort of insight on that?
Well, I mean, I think it's been a very sudden change, right? I mean, there's a lot of questions that we have to ask ourselves in the second Trump administration that we have literally no history of asking ourselves. And that is not necessarily a media problem so much as that's a national problem, right? Like for example, we don't have a secret service. We have CSIS that does internal counterterrorism measures and which does internal threats to security, but we don't have foreign agents in other countries. And now that America is really pulling back from the world and pulling back from us, and the tariff threat is, it's explicitly, Trump has said it's an attempt to soften us up for annexation. So it is a threat to our sovereignty. It is a threat to our national security. We don't we've never there's a bunch of very nasty questions that we have to ask ourselves as a people that we've essentially not had to, because big bad America has been taking care of us. And those include things like what a Canadian Secret Service looks like. It include what does it mean to have to defend yourself against the United States. It's realpolitik questions that are, I think, just totally foreign to not just our like our intellectual community as it exists, but also just to the country, right? Because always been wider international systems. We've always been part of, the post-war American order. We were, we considered ourselves integral members of of NATO and the World Trade Organization, and before then, it was the Commonwealth and the British Empire. And so we've always been part of systems like that, and we're kind of entering a period where we're not, and we're going to have to stand on our own. And those force a lot of difficult questions that are just simply there's no one who has asked them, so it's natural that there's no one reporting on them.
So definitely it's been, definitely when I did international relations at Trinity College and international relations at Norman Patterson School of International Affairs, it was never among any contemplated course or subject matter to talk about a prospective U.S. invasion. I know that when I had campaigned in the 1988 free trade election, we had always talked about the idea of us Canada being assimilated as an economic colony by mostly by sort of honey, the treatment and seduction more than an actual military invasion. So with that in mind, there's I guess an old saying that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Is there sort of a truth that back in World War II, many people didn't think that Hitler was going to invade. Neville Chamberlain thought it was, he could just talk to Hitler and he would stop his, rhetoric. So when you talked about, for example, that we have not been in this place before and, but at the same time, we're dealing with a society south of us that's becoming authoritarian. Do we need to start thinking about the unthinkable and not letting history repeat itself by when Europe was taken off guard, when Hitler decided to start invading its neighbors, as the rhetoric that President Trump keeps following in terms of over Canada and Greenland.
I think we absolutely do need to start thinking about the unthinkable. I think it's going to be very hard for us. I think our national tendency towards complacency and our national tendency towards thinking virtuously, thinking the best of these systems, it is going to be a very hard for us to overcome. I mean, not just at the level of international relations, but at the military level, and at the grounding political level of national survival, right? I don't think you need to go back to Hitler to get an example of this. I mean, I think Ukraine is a very recent example. And the trains from Mariupol were half empty on the day before the invasion. Like, absolutely nobody believed. Well, not absolutely nobody, but huge majorities of both the expert class and ordinary people simply didn't believe that Russia would invade because they thought it would be a form of national suicide for Russia, which it turns out to have been in many ways, right? But that is absolutely a warning to us. But I think, more than the warning and starting to think about the unthinkable, that government is trying to break us economically. We are already subject to misinformation and disinformation campaigns, not just from America, but from China and from Russia and from Iran. For all of our diasporic communities are subject to social media manipulation that we are doing nothing to counter. And we have made ourselves very vulnerable because we are not asking hard questions. And I think not only do we have to start thinking about the unthinkable, let's start with recognizing the actual critical threats we face right now and what we can do about them immediately, because we're also not doing even that.
With that in mind, one of the you talk about Ukraine and stuff like that. I've noticed when I've looked at social media is that among Canadian and among those particularly who are moving from Florida, one of them remarked, "Are we going to have be at war with the United States?" I think that there has been more, and with all this spontaneous elbows up movement in Canada, I think that Canadians have become very sensitized to this possibility that you talk about in your article, particularly in Quebec, the remarkable shift from a separatist conscious society to one which is embracing Canada is quite remarkable in response to Trump. So my other question to you is that, is there perhaps what I would call a dangerous lag between the sensitivity and broadening of consciousness among Canadians and our politicians? Because it seems to me that our politicians do not, there's a lag, we don't have the Pierre Elliott Trudeau's, the John Turners, these type of politicians which would on our behalf and be strong. What we have is, so I'm just wondering to get your insight, is our political establishment compared to its readiness in previous decades and how we would deal with these sort of situations, is there a lag between the strength of our political establishment and the consciousness in Canada?
I think you've really put your finger on the nub of the problem there. I mean, although I wouldn't say necessarily that it's the political class, because the political class actually move relatively quickly. What I'm more worried about is, like, if you take the example of the Canadian military, where we have about 72,000 troops, and they are an elite force, and they have been in existence for at least since 1989, but genuinely before then, to basically it be in a state of interoperability with American forces. They are built for expeditionary missions where we are basically plug and play with American forces, right? And NATO forces to a lesser extent. The careers of everyone in the military has been built on integration with America. And I mean, I think in a more broad question, that's also true of our business elites. It's also true, like, I write for the Atlantic, I write for the New Yorker and the New York Times. That has given me a name because I've integrated myself into the American economy, right? And we've been integrating ourselves with America since 1965, since the Auto Pact, really. And that presents us with a certain psychological problem, which is that it's not necessarily that the people in the military and the people in the political establishment can't see what's going on, but they've been trained to do one thing. They've been rewarded for doing one thing, which is integrating into America. And how do we create structures where we recognize that has to be opposed, right? Where that has to be countered. And it's very and I think that's true not just of the military, although that to me is the most extreme example, but it's also true of the diplomatic corps. It's true of a lot of the civil service that deals with business and trade, and how much can we turn? How much can we get over this complacency that we can't do things the way that we've been doing them for 50 years? I think literally the future of the country hinges on whether we're capable of making that turn. And I think it's a lot to ask. Like, I don't think it's easy when you have a career, military leader who, Donald Trump makes a remark one day and you're suddenly supposed to change everything because of this idiot. But we have to, because countries that are falling apart the way that the United States is falling apart become very dangerous to their neighbors, like one way or the other, and we have to prepare for that danger.
With respect to that, one of the important points you put in your article in terms of if an invasion actually took place is what the reaction is what the reaction would be of the Canadian military. Would they just simply be walked over? Would they try to sabotage based upon their deep integration with the United States? Which leads me to the other question, which has not been dealt with in any type of media to any serious capacity, is whether a number one threat, so to speak, for lack of a better word, to our sense of sovereignty when one nation like the United States starts talking about potentially annex us, does NORAD in itself, has there been a lack of real political discussion on whether NORAD, which is basically a full integration of the Canadian military in a U.S. A deep integrated U.S.-Canadian structure where we're pretty much locked to the knees and the hips, is that a discussion that we need to have as Canadians? The second issue, which I think is taken for granted by most countries as a natural issue, is our military territorial preparedness to an invasion. Like, I try to talk, have sort of a media discussions and interviews with the Canadian military about this, Canadian armed forces, and that seemed to be a very much a taboo sort of subject, is our territorial preparedness for a prospective invasion. So is that something we need to start talking about more? Or to, our structure of our armed forces to resist any potential territorial threat, no matter how remote it may be, in light of what happened in the War of 1812 and the potential threat of NORAD to our sovereignty in light of the hostile, belligerent, professed desires of our neighbors south of the border. Is that something that we need to discuss more in terms of the Canadian media?
I mean, Mark Carney was elected on the old relationship is over, the integration is ending. Need to find a new path. They had no chance unless he had. The Canadian people gave him a very clear mandate for this, and I think that includes military questions. I've been with some of my work that hasn't come out yet. I've been talking to Finnish and Estonian and Taiwanese, people about from those countries about how they live next to essentially monster psycho countries that are where any conflict would just be hugely asymmetric. And I mean, they basically have whole society defenses, right, which are conscription plus essentially, right? And I think I personally believe that we need to start thinking about models like that, not just necessarily because of the American crisis, but one thing that these whole society defenses are particularly good at is dealing with natural disasters. We are obviously entering a period where we are increasingly going to have environmental crises that we are going to need large scale efforts to fix. And in Finland and these countries, these are very effective methods of dealing with them. So I, I personally believe that this is a moment where Canada needs to fundamentally grow up on a very basic level, and what that means on a practical level is actually pretty enormous changes. That's what I believe. Are we going to be able to get there? I really hope so. But it will require an immense effort.
Yeah, well, that definitely, that's what I sort of had in mind in terms of my concept, was the idea of a national territorial defense force, which would be both for our military territorial defense and for environmental emergencies, almost like a peace corps that would deal with fires and all sorts of natural disasters. I think that and that would deal with encouraging Canadians to serve in a way which is protecting the country, like what they tried, like with Israel, for example, and these
Yeah.
other countries, where they where they ins- where they develop a sort of a foster an environment where people who are born into society think it natural to be able to defend their territory. So I think that if we
Yeah.
in Canada were able to develop this idea of like what they have in Israel, of fostering that sense of national defense, I think that would encourage more military recruits, because I think a lot of people don't want to join the military right now because they're afraid they're going to be shipped off to Afghanistan or some other country. But if they know that they're going to serve in Canada and protect our sovereignty from the threats of Trump or natural disasters, I think that will create a new positive perception of military service and serving and take advantage of this national consciousness that we want to defend our sense of our society from an annexation threat.
Of course, and the other point I fully agree with everything you said, but also like one of the things about Canada is that we're not an ethnic unity and we're hugely geographically diverse, right? Like we have a lot of difference in us. I think that's maybe our greatest strength as a country, is that we actually have this way of processing difference. But one of the knock-on effects of basically, I mean, I really prefer the term whole society defense because it, rather than conscription, because it's not just for young men, it's for the whole of society. It's for, suddenly you have to have preparedness at your, you have emergency preparedness in your home. Older people learn how to do CPR, medical, like basic medical things. It is truly and is that it would bind the country together, right? At a moment when society seems to be fracturing and fragmenting at at an accelerating rate. I don't think that's a negligible benefit to this kind of proposal. I also think, like, this interoperability model that we had with the United States is dead on arrival. Like, I mean, simply put, the future. I mean, one of the things that I've been interviewing people recently, and it's become very clear that the theory of war is really in a state of total flux. No one knows what war is going to look like. The recent strike in Ukraine was um, a real example of it. But like, but also the idea that Russia could sustain 1 million casualties is also not something that would have made any sense really like 20 years ago. We're on a line that goes around the globe that is between authoritarian powers and democratic powers, and they backslide into each other, and that's the world we actually need to be prepared for. And that world is not one in which we have interoperability militarily with the United States. It just isn't.
Yeah. With that in mind, with respect to going a little back on NORAD and stuff, one of my concerns is that as Canadians, is that we need to potentially rethink NORAD so that we don't have an integrated military defense structure, but we have two separate military structures which work together um, as sovereign military structures in such a way that we will be able to protect ourselves from any annexation looming from that particular military, to have separate military intelligence and separate military infrastructure so that we are cooperating as equals and not as in this mesh where we have a threat of annexation and we are all meshed up together at the hips. So
Right.
that's what I think is a conversation that we're not having in light of the constant annexation threats. So that's one
Well,
of the
one of the guys I interviewed for the Atlantic piece, he was co-chair of NORAD, right? Like, he was stationed in Denver, right? Like, he ran it for, I think, 6 or 7 years. Like, he was, and I mean, when you talk to him now, he's like, well, you can't hold Canada. Like, we'll come for you across the border. I mean, he's mad, right? Like, he's not in a let's all pretend this is going to go away with America mood. I think largely that is a question. I mean, the people I interviewed recently about, like, there were, the whole society defense is one answer to stopping the threat of annexation. The other answer is to become a nuclear power ourselves, right? Which would be a truly massive change to our entire national identity and psyche, I believe. And also, many people believe that it wouldn't be a credible threat because bombing your neighbors then it just has direct effects on you, right, on your own country. So it would not be a credible threat. But certainly Aisha Ahmad, who, a very, very serious expert on the nature of insurgency and counterinsurgency. I mean, she said to me, and she's the one quoted in the Atlantic Order, she said to me, if you don't have nuclear weapons, you're a snack for authoritarians, right? And I mean, that gave me a lot of pause, right? So I think everything's on the table. I think the answer to me that seems clearly the most, um, especially when you think that, like, let's just remember that around 2% of Americans think they should militarily annex Canada. Right now, things are changing. The American people can obviously be convinced of any nonsense that you tell them. There are many insane ideas that would have seemed totally impossible 5 years ago that are now absolutely in the mainstream of American thought. And it's entirely possible that annexing Canada would become that. However, let's just remember that there's not a lot of will for this right now. And so we like having a civil defense force, particularly, I mean, in the North is a no-brainer. Like, we need to do that immediately, right? Like, I think everyone would agree that we need a much stronger presence in the Arctic than we currently have. But I mean, other than that, I believe a civil defense force, or really a whole society defense, is the best option for us. But we have to make a pick. We have to just we cannot keep going on the way we are going. That much I know.
Hmm. I think the whole society defense force would be something very easy for Canada. I think that if we are a society of about 400 well 40 million people, and all we needed was about 1% of that, 400,000, to volunteer for such a whole society defense force. And that, in my view, would be more than enough to protect ourselves territorially from any perception that we are a pushover to a military annexation. So I think that that definitely I think that people would be attracted to the idea of protecting the homeland as far as Canada, as well as other constructive environmental and emergency projects that won't entail being shipped outside of Canada. I think that people would be attracted to that. But my shock is that when I try to have this conversation with people from the Canadian Armed Forces, they seem to run away like I was presenting kryptonite to Superman. There seemed to be no
It's
interest
the
in that.
nightmare scenario for their careers, right? They've been literally doing the opposite their whole lives and being rewarded for it, and now suddenly, I mean, it's not even their fault. It's just the most natural thing in the world to be resistant to so much change. I mean, Finland can field 1 million people in 48 hours. Right, they have 5 million people, right? Like, and they do that because and also, because they do that, they take things like misinformation and other threats from Russia way more seriously. It's way more integrated into their educational system. They're just much more, and like the nation building aspects of all aspects of nation building are much more prominent because of that. So, I mean, I really believe Carney has a mandate building, for breaking down divisions within the country, and for pretty radical change, like structural change. And I think it will come to the military, right? I think it has to.
Is it fair to say that as Canadians, based upon what you referred to in terms of Finland, is it fair to say that if we as Canadians want to fundamentally deal with the threat of annexation and show that we're not a pushover to Trump, do we need to take a stand and free our military from a psychological context where they are in a deep integration mindset, which prevents themselves from contemplating how they can create a structure that's independent and able to withstand any sort of annexation that's equivalent to what happened in the War of 1812? Do we need to take a stand and say that our military needs to be decoupled from this deep integration context with the United States so that we can cultivate a psychology in a society like Finland, that we're going to stand up for Canadians and stand up for Canada? Because I think that the perception of we not having that has made us fair game to the constant rhetoric of the 51st state. And if the Americans started seeing us taking this serious approach to decoupling ourselves and standing up for ourselves, I think that that would put ourselves in a radically different mindset as being pushovers, as many people in the Trump administration seem to think we are, which is a dangerous
Uh,
mindset.
I mean, what you like, the lesson from history, and the lesson of every expert on authoritarianism I've ever spoken with, including especially the ones I talked to about the next civil war, is that the only thing authoritarians understand is threat. Right? Like, what they understand is, like, if it's easy to walk in and take Canada, why don't we do it? If it's hard, let's not do it. That's what the Finnish understanding of Russia is like, if Russia decided to take Finland, they probably could, but it would be unbelievably brutal for them. It would be unbelievably hard for them to do, right? And they would feel it. They would suffer, right? And we need to create that boundary. Now, I'm not I don't really I don't think we need to, like, blame the military, or we need to, like, the military we have is very good for what we've asked it to do. There is a very sudden turn on a lot of fronts in Canadian life. You know, on like businesses are having to readjust, the diplomatic corps is having to readjust. Everything is in a period of readjustment. That will come for the military. But I mean, I really believe it's going to be decided on a policy level, and then the military will implement it. The question is, how much of the policy level are we going to be, are we actually going to have the will to do, and will the politicians understand that we have the will to do it? Because I actually think the Canadian people really have a will to do it. I think we want to stay a democracy. I think we want to stay a multicultural democracy, and we want to stay sovereign, and we want to stay ourselves, and we want our system that we have, we like it. I mean, we complain, and we all have our problems, but we want ultimately this system to thrive. And when the chips are down, as you saw, even Quebec, even the chiefs out west, they're being very clear about it, right? And so I think I think there is a will. It's just a huge thing to get over the complacency. I mean, that's not anyone's fault. That's just a natural burden to try and get over.
And one more very important point, which I wanted to speak to you about, which has been troubling me, is another point which you had in one of your articles about, and this was in reference to what could happen after a prospective invasion, is quislings. You referred to, there would be the quislings that would want to buy into this sort of any invasion context. But my concern right now is in fact a possibility that even before an invasion, do we have quislings which are operating right now, which are painting themselves to be in a completely different light than who they actually Canadians think of them. And my particular reference is this idea of the Golden Dome, which in my view is the Golden Dome, and this whole ballistic missiles in Canada has been an idea which has been rejected by Chrétien in the 90s. It was an idea rejected by Paul Martin because of its threat of on Canadian sovereignty, even before there was this sort of hostile Trump agenda. And all of a sudden, while Prime Minister Carney has talked about, oh yeah, we are not going to talk to Trump. He started off saying we're not going to talk to Trump if he kept this 51st state rhetoric, but he still talked to him. And now he's saying, oh yeah, we're going to have secret discussions with President Trump about the Golden Dome, and that we received a mandate to have this revised economic and military partnership with the United States. I mean, so in my view, that's very dangerous, because Canadians didn't give him a mandate. This is just my opinion anyway, but Canadians didn't give Mr. Carney a mandate to have a so-called new political and military partnership with the United States, to give him a mandate to stand up for Canadian independence. So why is Mr. Trump all of a sudden in negotiations with a Golden Dome, which in my humble opinion, we don't need? We're not Israel. There's no imminent threat of an attack like Israel. Why is he contemplating this Golden Dome unless he has an agenda, Mr. Carney, to talk rhetoric about Canadian independence while selling us out, so that when we have a negotiation, so-called, between Mr. Trump and Mr. Carney, the manifestations of that negotiation is essentially, oh yeah, well, we made some concessions so that we wouldn't have to spend $61 million, which amounts to us becoming a 51st state. So this is my fear or concern. I want to get your insight on, is there a possibility that our Prime Minister is actually a wolf in sheep clothing, and we're going to get caught with our pants down with what implicitly is going to be a sellout under the pretext that we need a dome when we don't really need a dome. And the only person that seems to be raising alarm bells is Bob Ray, when he said, oh, well, this whole thing, he's trying to hold us hostage with $61 billion. I mean, do you think this is a possibility that Mr. Carney is actually a quisling who is involved with secret negotiations to make us what will amount to a 51st state, in order to, on the pretext that we need a so-called Golden Dome? Like, I wanted to get your insight on that.
I would put the chances of that at near zero. I mean, I'm not party to the inner workings of Mark Carney's brain or of his inner circle, but the Golden Dome is one of those Trump ideas, like we're gonna build a Riviera on in Gaza. Like, it really doesn't matter what you say about it, like, because it's so outlandish that you may as well just not say anything. I mean, if Mark Carney's a quisling, he's like the world's worst quisling. He's starting us into the rearmament process in Europe, which I think is our destiny, right? Like, we're just going to be closer to the free democracies of Europe than to into the increasingly backsliding America. I also think there is a really tricky point here, which is that America is not necessarily our enemy. Only about a half of it is, right? And that creates a weird position for us. Also, like, I think this increase in trade routes elsewhere, we are moving away from America. Like, I probably not as fast and as hard as you and I would like, but the move is underway. And I think it's not necessarily anyone's choice. It's that there's no choice in the matter. It's that America's falling apart, and we have to just get away from this burning house as fast as we can. I don't think like the Quislings and so on, like what Isha talks about there is, she talks about, like, essentially when you get into these insurgency situations, they fundamentally take on a life of their own. Like, there is no political solution to them, right? Like, there are different counterinsurgency strategies. I discuss some of them in the book, like cutting off the head and so on, like that. None of them work, right? And certainly no. The only one that works is Groznification, where you just flatten it and basically turn it into a parking lot. It's very hard to turn Canada into a parking lot, right? Like, it's quite big, right? So I mean, I think what I was describing in the book, or in the essay, about what a Canadian insurgency would look like, that's not necessarily what anyone would want. It's just what would happen, because that's what happens when you kill people's mothers. Like, if you going, like, Aisha had this wonderful point, which is like, there are no such things as warrior races or anything like that. If you kill somebody's mother, as she said, the latte sipping, Pokemon card collecting students in my class, if you kill their mothers, they're gonna go to war with you, right? And so that kind of force would be underway. I don't think I actually think the national unity we're experiencing right now is pretty extraordinary, and I would never have predicted it. Right, like, I never would have seen that kind of unity emerging in this country ever. And I mean, I also think, he's only been elected for, how long has it been now? A month? I mean, we have to wait and see what plays are getting made, but I will tell you that I think we're headed in the right direction. I mean, I think the civil service is going to be more of a problem than Mark Carney.
No, I mean, definitely, in terms of what his rhetoric, it sounds like it's in the right direction. But my concern is, why doesn't, in the similar fashion of when Prime Minister Coercion was, presented with the idea of putting anti-ballistic missiles on Canadian soil, he immediately said, "We're not interested." He didn't say that we're going to negotiate. He said, "We're not interested." Paul Martin was not interested for the same reason, at the threat to Canadian sovereignty.
Yeah.
Why doesn't Mr. Carney say, "You know what? We are not interested in your Golden Dome. It's not a Canadian priority. Our Canadian priority is housing, healthcare, da da da. We're not interested in any price tag associated with participating in your Golden Dome. As a sovereign country, we're not interested in getting a free Golden Dome by becoming a state. We're just not interested." Why doesn't he say that? And consistent with his other, pro-Canada sovereignty rhetoric, why doesn't he do that? Then sort of go through this process of, we're going to go through some negotiations that we're not going to inform you about because we don't put our negotiations in the public spotlight. Like, why is he doing that then, if he's not contemplating some kind of treachery of some kind? This is what I'm trying to figure out. What is that all about?
This is just a
Secret
guess.
negotiation.
Like, I'm not, I'm obviously not in Mark Carney's mind or in his inner circle. But the reason Chrétien and Paul Martin could say that is because they were saying it to reasonable human beings who had some understanding of a general political framework. When you're dealing with Donald Trump, you're dealing with a reality television star, and you have to be extremely careful about the performative aspects of what you say, especially